The rain at Great Meadows wasn't just weather, it was the main character in the story. It fell in sheets, turning the trenches into canals, seeping into cartridge boxes, and fouling the powder until it was useless paste. A 22-year-old colonel stood in the mud, watching his first command dissolve. His name was George Washington, and everything he'd worked for, the rank, the honor, the chance to prove himself, was washing away in that downpour. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the brutal, necessary beginning. The forge where a leader is made isn't a throne room, it's a swamp. To understand why he was standing in that flooded trench, we have to go back a few months to a very different Washington. This was a young man burning with what he himself called a glowing zeal. He wasn't motivated by money he'd served without pay. He was driven by something far more dangerous for a soldier. A hunger for personal distinction. He was a major of the Virginia militia, ambitious, proud, and convinced that spirit could overcome any obstacle. This was the arrogance that set the stage for disaster. His first taste of combat came not at the fort, but in a forest glen. A French patrol under Ensign Jumonville was discovered. What happened next is murky, but it ended with Jumonville dead, shot by the British or their Mingo allies. In a letter to his brother, Washington described the sound of those first bullets whistling past. He called it charming. It's a telling word. It speaks to the thrill of the moment, the intoxication of danger, the vanity of a young man seeing war as an adventure. He didn't yet hear the echo of those shots, an echo that would pull France and Britain into a global war. He'd acted impulsively, and the reaction was swift. A powerful French force marched from their new fort, Duquesne, to find the man who had killed their envoy. Washington, instead of retreating to a strong position, made a fatal miscalculation. He decided to stand his ground at a place called Great Meadows. He built a small, circular stockade right in the middle of a boggy bottomland. His more experienced guide, a frontiersman named Christoffer Gist, likely warned him. The half-king, his Mingo ally, was frustrated. The site was indefensible, surrounded by wooded hills with no clean water source. It was a trap of his own making, but the young colonel believed in the power of his will. He named the place, with a grim irony he couldn't yet see, Fort Necessity. He believed he was building a bastion. He was actually digging his own grave. The siege began on July 3rd. The French and their Indian allies didn't need to storm the fort. They simply took positions on the high ground, hidden among the trees, and began a steady, galling fire into the muddy enclosure. Washington's men, packed together and exposed, fired back. But their powder was already damp. The rain, that relentless rain, was the true enemy. It filled the trenches they crouched in. It rendered their muskets useless. The historian Ron Chernow captures the desperation. The men were half drowned, their firelocks so wet they were little more than clubs. The French, with a commander's cruel insight, didn't just target the soldiers. They methodically shot every horse, every cow, every dog. They were eliminating not just the garrison, but its hope. By evening, the situation was hopeless. The ground was a quagmire, the food was nearly gone, and many of the soldiers, chilled and terrified, had broken into the rum supply meant for the Indians and were drunk. As dusk fell, the French called for a parley. Washington, with no options left, sent an officer who spoke French. The terms they brought back were stark. Surrender. The English could march away with the honors of war, but they had to abandon their cannon and leave 2 officers as hostages. There was one more clause, buried in the French document. Because of the poor translation by his interpreter, Jacob van Braam, Washington didn't fully grasp it. He signed a paper that stated he had assassinated Jumonville. It was a public relations coup for the French and a lasting humiliation for Washington. Washington had been defeated and then tricked into admitting a war crime. The next morning, the bedraggled column marched out of Fort Necessity. The French allowed them to keep their personal arms, but the retreat back to civilization was a nightmare of hunger and exhaustion. Washington had lost a third of his men. He returned to Virginia, expecting to be court-martialed, his reputation in ruins. But here's the counterintuitive turn, the lesson hidden in the mud. His reputation wasn't destroyed. Far from it. The Virginia House of Burgesses publicly thanked him and his officers for their bravery. The public saw the real villains as the other colonies that failed to send support, and the contractors who failed to deliver supplies. They saw a young officer who had stood his ground against impossible odds. Why did this failure not break him? Because it taught him the necessity of equilibrium. The young lion who thought willpower could conquer all learned the hard limits of terrain, weather, and supply. The man who found the sound of bullets charming learned the grim reality of command and the weight of every decision. This humiliation forged a deeper, more enduring strength. The disciplined endurance that would define him at Valley Forge decades later. He learned that true strength isn't found in the bold, rash action, but in the calm, stubborn ability to endure disaster without losing purpose. The arrogant ambition of youth was tempered into a leader's resilient core. That day in the rain changed everything. The disaster at Fort Necessity didn't end Washington's career. It secured it by teaching him the one lesson his youthful pride couldn't: how to face failure. It comes down to this. How we handle our disasters defines us more than the disasters themselves. We all have our Fort Necessities, those moments when our plans dissolve into mud. The question isn't whether we will face them, but what we learn in the aftermath. Do we let humiliation harden into bitterness? Or like Washington, do we let it teach us equilibrium, the disciplined endurance to carry on, wiser and more resilient? That's the cyclical wisdom of history. It shows us that the roots of monumental strength are often found in the mud of our greatest defeats. If you're facing your own difficult season, remember the lesson of the rain at Great Meadows. Subscribe for more stories that help us find perspective in the past.